Let's begin by looking at what PowerQuery Editor is. PowerQuery is a tool that allows you to extract and import data into Excel for further analysis. For example, websites, CRM, accounting software, databases, to name just a few. Almost all data sets will contain data columns, rows you don't require, or contain errors. Alternatively, the data set might be too large for Excel to load, and perhaps you may only require a few thousand rows. Using PowerQuery Editor, you will be able to reduce the data size set and do a hell of a lot more. So that's the generalized overview of what PowerQuery offers. I will begin by using PowerQuery to open NHS Health and Social Care Information Centre Prescribed Diabetes CSV file I downloaded from their website. I'll click the Data tab and click the New Query button in the ribbon. I select from the drop down from File and click from CSV. This opens a navigation window for me to locate the file and click Import. Casting my eyes to the right, I see Applied Steps. I click Source. To the right there are two gears. Clicking on the gears allows me to make changes. If I look at the columns, they're not very descriptive and certainly not helpful. I must have more descriptive column names if the users are to make sense of this data. I check the first row, I look up at the ribbon and click the first row as Header button. Columns now show a more descriptive name. If I so wish, I can rename columns by double-clicking the column header and typing a more descriptive title. Let's suppose I wanted to undo the changes I've just made. Looking at the Applied Steps box, I see Promoted Headers. To the left, a cross. I click this and changes are removed. To reinsert more descriptive header title, I simply click the first row as Header button. My next objective is to reduce the number of rows. This capability is useful as you may come across datasets with millions of rows and Excel will never be able to load that. So let's suppose I only wanted the first 100 rows. I click the Keep Rows drop-down arrow and select Keep Top Rows option. In the next window, I enter 100. I want to point out, in PowerQuery Preview window, you will only ever see the first 200 rows. So if I entered 10,000 rows, I would only see 200 in the Preview Query window. When I click the Close and Load icon, I would be able to view the 10,000 rows in the workbook sheet. But I'm going to click Refresh Preview, and guess what? I only see 100 rows. No real surprise there. I can remove columns and all rows if required. By clicking the column drop down, I can see if the column has subcategories. Generally, if a column has additional categories, that might be reason enough to retain the column. If I click Chemical Drug column, I can see the column is blank. It means there's no entries in that column whatsoever. I may as well delete this column. Let's suppose I wish to retain only 3 or 4 columns. Select them and click Remove Columns. Drop down arrow and select Removed Other Columns. If the data set has duplicate entries, I can click and remove Duplicate button. But first I select the columns with the data I wish to check and remove duplicates. I select Year, Drug Area, Units and click Remove Duplicates. In this case there are no duplicates, but if I had used multiple data sets, then it's quite possible duplicates may occur. I can, if I so choose, select a range of rows to retain. I click the Keep Rows button, or arrow button, the little drop down arrow, and select Keep Range of Rows. In the next window, I enter the first row number, and in the last row box, I enter the last row number and click OK. If I had errors in a dataset, I can simply click the Remove Errors button. If I find I've made a mistake, I can click Delete the last step. I can sort using the column drop-down arrow, or alternatively, having selected the column, I can then click the A to Z button in the ribbon. There are tools these are the tools we use for data reduction and to sort data sets. When I'm happy, I simply click Close and Load. Let's look at transforming data. We'll begin by returning to the diabetes data query. In many tables you will be working with, you might find a need to reorder columns. For example, org code might be key ID, and you prefer to place that column position as the first column. Simply click the column to highlight, holding the mouse key down, drag the column to your chosen position. Let's assume the drug area column shouldn't have any blank entries. I click the column drop down arrow, and in the sub window I untick blank. Now all the rows without drug area entries are removed. If you cast your eyes over to data value column, you may notice numbers aligning to the left. If you're familiar with Excel, you'll know this means entries are text and not numerical. Why? The probable reason the data didn't start in a database or Excel, and when imported into Excel, the data was identified as being ambiguous data. Consequently, such data is marked as text. Let's remedy that. I click the column to highlight, then click the data type text drop down arrow and select decimal numbers in this case. In some data sets you will see a null in a cell. Null means the cell holds no value, and if there was a calculation, this would be ignored. In other words, the cell wouldn't be considered to have a value. If the cell has a 0, then calculation would be made but no value assigned. If you wish to replace null with zeros, you can use the Replace Values button. However, you should be aware you cannot leave a cell with nothing. Click the Transform tab and you will see the Fill button. The Fill button is used for calculation column. It fills the column with value. The data type options are dependent upon which type of column you are in. For example, if the column holds numerical decimal values, you can change the number to a whole numerical value. If you need to round a number up or down, choose the number column option in the ribbon. If you wish to apply cube, square values, then click the scientific drop down arrow. If it's a text column, then select the column and look up at the ribbon and select text column. Format arrow drop down and select the option. For example, in the prescribers column with England entries, I choose all capitals. Let's assume I need to undertake some time analysis. Looking at the year column, I immediately see year entries are text. Click the column to highlight, and looking at the ribbon, click Data Type Text drop down arrow and select Date. All the year entries will automatically be set for the start of the year. Now, let's take a moment to step back and look at applied steps. Let's assume change type is something I feel I really no longer need. I can simply delete. But note, a warning message appears stating subsequent steps may be affected. So we need to be careful and consider the implications. What are the implications? Well, that really comes down to the preceding steps you have set up. In this case, none. More often than not, if a subsequent calculation was involved related to the step being deleted, then step removal will have implications. Suppose I wanted to unpivot selected columns. This feature is particularly useful if the data needs to be shown as rows rather than columns. In the example, I select data value and units, and in the ribbon select unpivot. You will need to rename the columns. I should point out, if you choose to edit workbook sheet then return to query editor, you will see alterations you made to your worksheet aren't reflected in the data being pulled into the worksheet. What does this mean? Well, PowerQuery is still requesting the data and when you close and load, all your previous worksheet alterations will disappear. In other words, all the data will be posted to the worksheet as originally set in PowerQuery. This means all the time you spent configuring your worksheet will be wasted. The moral here is use PowerQuery to edit your data import into Excel.